Hey everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. In this one, we're talking about NZXT's revision to its XMP warranty support and some issues we have with NZXT's phrasing in the updates. TSMC stock price skyrocketing, and also in TSMC news, Intel looking to potentially up its orders from Taiwan Semiconductor in the face of its recent 7nm delay announcements. Intel might be facing a potential class action as well, relating to its 7nm delay. And then we've got a couple of other news items as well, like, for example, AMD's second quarter 20 earnings and the virtual crowds that are getting added into sports now. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's RTX 2060 KO. We previously reviewed the RTX 2060 KO model for its fused down RTX 2080 die that uniquely benefited Blender and some professional applications, offering better performance than expected in some pro workloads while offering usual strong RTX 2060 performance for gaming. EVGA is actively restocking its RTX 2060 KO with new dies, which you can find linked in the description below. So first up, quick note, the NZXT BLD PC that we bought for a review a while ago and then we put it up for a charity auction on eBay, where 100% of the proceeds are going towards Cat Angels. We talked about this in the previous news video. That build did sell in the charity auction. However, for the first time, we've encountered this issue, which, as I understand it, is fairly common when trying to do this type of thing, where the person who won it isn't paying and isn't responding to our requests for communication. So we're gonna relist it. It will be linked in the description below. This time, we're only going to list it for a couple days, as opposed to the full 7, to try and tighten the timeline to reduce the chance of this happening again. Do not bid on it at all unless you're willing to pay for the price that you're typing in. Because if you're just trying to drive the numbers up for other people thinking you're doing something good, it's actually not. It's just creating a huge headache, and it starts to create issues where now we have to relist the thing and the charity's looking at the auction going, oh my gosh, can't believe it sold for that much, and then they don't get any of it because the person doesn't pay. So don't bid on it unless you actually want it. People think of it in with the best intentions, but it doesn't actually play out that way. Anyway, we're going to relist it. It's going to be signed by the team. All the same stuff applies as before. If you're curious about it, go watch the previous news video where we announced that, and it's all the same stuff. It's just being relisted. So we'll link that below. All right, first major news item. Intel may be facing potential legal trouble over its 7nm delay that it recently announced. And that's as if Intel didn't already have enough to deal with at this time. So Intel delivered huge news last week. It announced, if you missed it, that 7nm process production will be delayed until 2022 to 2023. And that's with yields approximately 12 months behind the internal target goals. The stock market, as you might expect, went crazy after this news, and that was for everybody involved, not just Intel, but all the silicon companies. Intel stock in particular, though, plummeted, and its market cap shed roughly $43 billion as a result of that news. Now, Huggins Berman law firm is looking to represent investors who have, quote, suffered significant losses under a possible class action lawsuit. The law firm is currently investigating the possibility of securities fraud perpetrated by Intel. The investigation and the subsequent lawsuit, should it materialize, would hinge on proving that Intel willingly and knowingly concealed manufacturing and performance issues around its 7nm production from investors. In the law firm's press release, the firm quoted Stacy Raskin of Sanford C. Bernstein, who said the 7nm delay news was, quote, the worst we have seen in our career covering the company, and, quote, whatever little credibility they had is out of the window. The law firm is also issuing a call to whistleblowers with non-public information to come forward in an effort to prove that Intel misled investors, according to the law firm's press release. There is more big Intel news attached to this as well. So Intel sort of reshuffled its deck after it took a mulligan after the 7nm delay, and it appears as though some internal restructuring is in order following the 7nm news. The biggest change was that Intel's chief engineering officer is exiting now, and that officer was over Intel's technology, its systems architecture, and its TSCG, or its client group, and that's been the case since at least 2018 at this point. So there's some shuffling in the executive stack. Following the exit of this employee from Intel, Intel's TSCG will now be split into 5 different divisions, and each of those will have its own discrete leader, and those leaders will report directly to CEO Bob Swan with no one in between them. The changes are as follows. Technology development, is going to be led by Dr. Ann Kelleher. Manufacturing and operations will be led by Kayvon Esfarjani. Design engineering will be led in the interim by Josh Walden, but Intel is still looking for a permanent team leader, so get your application in there. Architecture, software, and graphics will continue to be led by Raja Koduri, formerly of AMD, and supply chain will continue to be led by Dr. Randhir Thakur. As for why Intel is making these changes, well, typically Intel's had leadership changes surrounding its process delays. And it's not a coincidence that this is happening specifically now. So Intel states that its intentions with these changes are to improve focus, apparently, and to create more accountability in process technology, something that should have been resolved the first time this happened with 10 nanometer, which we're now still like 5 years waiting for at this point in desktop DIY. Anyway, the resignation of its current chief engineering officer, Murthy Rendu-Chintala, will be on August 3rd of 2020, and my apologies on the name pronunciation, did my best. But that's going to be August 3rd for the effective date. Intel, in another news item before moving on to the rest of the industry, is reportedly increasing its orders at TSMC as well. These all tie together, these stories. So when Intel announced its 7 nanometer delay, it also suggested that it would be using third-party fabs wherever it made sense. And we've seen this before, as stated last week, where Intel, when it ran into 14 nanometer silicon supply issues and lack of availability of 14 nanometer in order to produce the CPUs that were in demand at the time, Intel stepped back to bring some of its older chipsets on previous process nodes like 22 nanometer. It started spinning those fabs back up again and making those chipsets so that it could free up space in the 14 nanometer fabs for what was really needed, which was CPUs at the time, especially server side where money's good. So Intel's now looking at moving to third-party fabs in addition to just freeing up some of its own fab space for on the chipset side. And in order to maintain its roadmap as much as possible, it's currently looking at TSMC. Intel already does a certain non-specific amount of business, at least as far as we can tell, with TSMC. And TSMC does make some of Intel's chipsets at present. It is certainly the process leader in the world at this point, even though it's true that Intel's 10 nanometer is supposed to equate AMD's, in quotes there, 7 nanometer for the combination of AMD engineering with TSMC engineering. Intel doesn't really have 10 nanometer, at least in this space. It does in some mobile deployments, but the argument of our 10 is equal to their 7 only matters if you actually have 10, and they don't, for the most part. So they're starting to lose more ground to the point where that defense won't hold up forever, clearly. Anyway, according to the reports, it seems that Intel could already be in talks with TSMC about reserving capacity. There have been reports on Extreme Tech, Hot Hardware, and Tom's Hardware in the past week about this. If you'd like to learn more, we'll link all those in our show notes and sources document below. But according to these reports, Intel is presumably interested in the 7 nanometer nodes. And so far, we don't have any indication as to what products would use TSMC's nodes other than Intel's Ponte Vecchio GPU, of which Intel already said would use a combination of internal and external process technology. So that in particular was somewhat already known. Separately, other reports, primarily out of industry profits Digitimes, are suggesting that Intel's and TSMC's partnership is temporary, meaning TSMC isn't treating Intel as a long-term customer and won't make any additional fab space to accommodate Intel's orders. TSMC went as far as saying that it viewed itself as more of a rescuer than a long-term partner for Intel, but time will tell. Next one is TSMC's stock price, bridging nicely with the previous news story. After Intel's 7 nanometer delay news broke last week, Intel stock took a nasty nosedive while AMD's got a shot in the arm. While we admittedly aren't stock experts, it's not really what we do here, we do know that stocks are a finicky thing, but the news was interesting nonetheless. We got a tip from a reader about this story, pointing out that AMD's stock wasn't the only one that got a boost. On the back of Intel's 7 nanometer news, it seems TSMC's stock shot up as well. TSMC's stock is currently sitting just above $78 per share, and it has a market cap of approaching $400 billion at the time of writing. as the user who sent us the tip pointed out, that puts it, in terms of market cap, above massive companies such as Walmart, Procter & Gamble, and AMD and NVIDIA. TSMC has also become one of the top 10 most valuable companies, depending on which Fortune listings you're looking at, and it's also one of the top 2 or 3 for Taiwan's export industry. So as noted at the beginning of this news video, we recently took one of NZXT's pre-builts in its BLD line for a test drive. Overall, we weren't impressed. There were some assembly issues where the power headers weren't really plugged in properly. 24 pin, for example, that +4 was on top of the 20 instead of under it, so it actually was coming out. The 4+4 wasn't plugged in properly. XMP was off, forfeiting about 9 to 10% performance, depending on the application tested, and also running below what NZXT officially advertised on its site. And warranty support was also subpar, where we created a new benchmark leveraging our experience with our own customer service team, where the main guy there doing our customer service for the GN store has been doing his work for about 15 years in CS now. So we worked with him to develop a benchmark. Anyway, you can watch the video if you want to learn more about it. But following all of that, we found out via Twitter from a lot of you that NZXT was not really allowing for XMP to be enabled in the immediate aftermath of our video while still offering a warranty. So one particular user with whom we interfaced was unhappy with his machine from NZXT due to a threat of a voided warranty should he then go and enable it. The user was expressing concern that NZXT had sold him a system with purportedly some speed memory. I think off the top of my head, I think it was 3600 was what was supposed to be in there, and it was running out something like 2400 or whatever JEDEC was for the configuration used. It's 24, 26 normally. And that was with a Ryzen 7 CPU, mind you. So of all the things to kneecap your memory performance on, go ahead from 36 to 2400 megahertz on a 3700X or whatever it was, is going to produce a pretty big performance hit. Anyway, the end result of that, we kind of signal boosted it on Twitter, tagged NZXT, made a big deal out of it after or around the time our video went up. And NZXT ended up backing down and saying that the user could actually enable XMP and would still be extended its warranty. Now, this led into XMP and the warranty surrounding it being completely reworked on NZXT's website. NZXT was calling this, and still is, RAM overclocking, and claimed that at the time it would void the BLD warranty, despite advertising XMP frequencies, which we believe to be, at best, misleading advertising. NZXT was also refusing to accept a return for the machine. So after the user went through several days of trouble, and after we weighed in on things, NZXT's blog post was posted with some ambiguous language, but it overall doubled back and updated its warranty regarding XMP and how it believes overclocking should be handled on the support side. This blog post has a lot of troublesome language in it where NZXT is not really committing firmly to some of the stuff it's saying. There's some weasel wording. It could be intentional, or it could be that the person who authored it is not particularly technical when it comes to memory. And if that's the case, then they probably should have gotten someone else to write it. Or it's being dumbed down by someone who does know what's going on to an extent that it's actually becoming very ambiguous. So part of what NZXT is saying is that overvolting equals overclocking, which, although increasing the voltage is tied to increasing the clocks, they are literally different things in the sense that one is called overvolting and one is called overclocking, which pertains to frequency. But good enough, they're close enough. You do both typically, but there are issues with that later on that we'll get back to. XMP profiles in general will require a slight bump in voltage to reach the XMP speeds. That is not always the case, but you're looking at a 1.2 volt official JEDEC specification to 1.35 on most memory modules, at least those that NZXT sells. That said, you can still reach 3200 with 1.2 volts on some of the kits out there. So it's not really the best move for NZXT to have a blanket statement out there of XMP voids the warranty because of a voltage concern. Not all XMP kits are 1.35 volts. That's a blanket statement, and that's not really the most accurate way to go around it. Separately, the XMP advertised speeds are within a completely reasonable, safe threshold. NZXT uses a lot of bold words and a lot of scary language like risk and damage and temperature, all associated with XMP, saying that overclocking has an inherent risk. This is overclocking. There's an inherent risk. In reality, when it comes to memory, one, the temperature, especially talking 1.2 to 1.35, is irrelevant. And two, it shouldn't matter because you go to an SI like NZXT specifically so that you can consolidate your warranties from 7 discrete components into basically one, the computer, and then go through NZXT for the warranty. And if you're saying, well, but NZXT has to go to someone if they have a claim, guess what? G-Skill and a lot of the other manufacturers like Kingston and HyperX do often have lifetime warranties rated against their advertised speeds. That is to say XMP specifically, not JEDEC. So this isn't a good excuse, and NZXT did end up walking it all back and saying you can turn on XMP, so that's good at least. But either way, the whole thing was stupid because in many aspects, you could work around this warranty. One, you just lie. If a company ever says, have you enabled XMP, you should not answer it truthfully, because if an SI or an OEM is saying, did you enable XMP, you should say, I don't know what that is, because it's probably trying to work a way into rejecting your claim for something that's entirely unrelated. Separately, in terms of getting around this, its warranty explicitly stated that enabling, or at least the tech support with customers interfacing with NZXT that we saw tweeted at us, those emails were saying that enabling XMP would void it, but you can still type in the numbers manually. It's not enabling XMP then. So there were plenty of ways to work around it. But anyway, if anyone actually does end up in a situation where you have to send a system back and XMP was on at some point, although this no longer applies to NZXT because they've done the right thing now and have allowed for it under the warranty because they're advertising those speeds. If you do run into a situation like this with another SI, just clear BIOS, clear CMOS, send it in. Anyway, part of the problem is that there's a lot of ambiguity in the write-up that reads, again, as if it was maybe oversimplified. NZXT says things like, quote, XMP profiles allow you to run your high-performance RAM above industry DDR specs, but they really need to be specifying what that means, because industry DDR specs isn't a thing. That doesn't actually mean anything. It can mean a lot of different things. For instance, AMD's Ryzen 3000 parts support 3200 megahertz memory stock right now. JEDEC is what NZXT functionally means, or perhaps NZXT means when it plugs the RAM in, that's what it considers to be the industry spec or whatever, but they don't mention the word JEDEC anywhere in the piece. NZXT also said, quote, until now, we've regularly allowed customers to make warranty claims through customer service, even when they overclock. So it made all the more sense to adopt this into our official policy, end quote, basically saying, we were doing this anyway, now we're just making it official. So from what we've seen, NZXT was actually preemptively declining warranty service if XMP got enabled, as shown in support messages sent to us. So this is sort of hand-waving its past behavior. It's good that NZXT has fixed it now, but there's no reason to act as if they always did it this way. Another one, quote, it may seem harmless, but enabling XMP is still a form of overclocking, just done automatically by enabling the XMP profile in your motherboard BIOS. Whatever the amount of voltage sent through a device is higher than stock voltage, there is a risk of hardware failure and higher temperatures. Not pretty. But if you're willing to take that risk, we're here for you. So first of all, sensing tone problem here of not pretty. Who says that? It makes it sound like it's genuinely written by someone who has absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Separately, taking a risk by enabling XMP is sort of an insane thing to say, and they're really trying to play it up and make it sound like this was some really scary thing, and look at how great NZXT is, it's coming to the rescue and now allowing you to do it, but before it was just protecting you from this tremendous risk of enabling XMP and running at 1.35 instead of 1.2 volts, which everyone has done since forever. Finally, another quote, however, we think it's important to note that while XMP can create some pretty cool results, it also comes with some risks, ... No matter how harmless it may seem, enabling XMP is still a form of overclocking, just done automatically through enabling XMP profiles in your motherboard BIOS. There's always a risk to overclocking. Usually when overclocking, you will be raising the voltage on which your specific piece of hardware runs. whenever the amount of voltage sent through a device is higher than stock voltage, there's a risk with hardware failure and higher temperatures. I will note that a lot of the motherboards, probably some of which NZXT has used at some point in its SI career, actually ship with often higher auto voltages than you can end up achieving with a higher clock and an easy 5-minute tune on V-Core with your CPU. So this is all written in a way that's trying to make it sound scary to people who don't know a whole lot about this, because ultimately none of this is really true in a wide sweeping sense as it's written. You can and very likely will end up with lower V-Core if you do it manually than if you run it automatically. One more thing to point out. The article also says, as you can see here, the default RAM speed is 1066 megahertz. And after the XMP profile is enabled, the current clock speed is 1597 megahertz. Keep in mind, RAM is double data rate. If your current clock speed is 1597 megahertz, your actual clock speed is 3197 megahertz. Viola, they say, you've just enabled XMP profiles on your RAM, and your RAM is currently running at advertised speeds. In other words, it's running at the speeds that we said it would when we sold it to you and didn't do it for you. But there's a technicality here before people kind of mix this up because of NZXT. Your actual clock speed in this example is not 3197. The wording is backwards. So if your effective clock, the word they want to use, is 3200, then your actual is 1600. Then DDR applies. But anyway, they've mostly made the right move. They've just kind of smothered it in all this hand-waving to try and sort of cover the tracks of why it was done in the first place. Anyway, NZXT's made mostly the right move, so good on them for doing that, but we would like to see maybe less fear-mongering as it pertains to getting computers up to the speeds that were advertised on the website. Next up, AMD second quarter 20 earnings. Unlike Intel, AMD has a lot to be happy about right now. The company's stock has been on a steady upward trend since the beginning of this year, and it continues to break its own revenue records. AMD's Zen architecture and partnership with TSMC continues to be a powerful catalyst for growth for AMD. AMD notched its best quarter in history just recently when it reported its quarterly revenue of $1.93 billion. That's a 26% jump year over year. AMD attributes this to record revenue from its computing and graphics segment, which is where Ryzen and Radeon live, respectively. Quarterly revenue was up 8% here, quarter over quarter, primarily driven by an increase in enterprise, embedded, and semi-custom segment revenue. Semi-custom would include the new consoles coming out. AMD's gross margin rose to 44% in the second quarter, up 3 points year over year. AMD also reported an operating income of $173 million, which is up from $59 million a year ago. AMD's net income came in at $157 million, which is also up from a year ago, which was reported at $35 at the time. According to Lisa Su, these figures are led by record notebook and server processor sales, and Ryzen and Epic revenue has more than doubled from a year ago. AMD also reported the following, quote, "Importantly, we met our double-digit server processor market share goal as data center products accounted for more than 20% of our second quarter revenue," said by Lisa Su in a conference call. Regarding Epic, AMD highlighted wins with Google for its virtual machines, AWS adding more Epic-powered instances, as well as Dell, HPE, IBM, and Supermicro, also expanding their Epic-based offerings. For the third quarter, AMD is forecasting a revenue of $2.55 billion, plus or minus $100 million, which would be a 42% increase year over year and a 32% increase sequentially. AMD notes that the increase would be driven by strong demand for Ryzen and Epic, as well as its next-generation semi-custom solutions. That is to say, the Xbox Series X and the Sony PS5. AMD is also reiterating its intent to launch both Zen 3 and RDNA 2 sometime this year. Next up, in an update to a story we ran a week or two ago, Bloomberg reports that NVIDIA and SoftBank, the holding group over ARM, are getting deeper into discussions of an acquisition. There's no formal news or announcement pertaining to this, and it's all through back-alley discussions, but the Bloomberg report says, quote, "NVIDIA is the only suitor in concrete discussions with SoftBank." As we mentioned last week, an NVIDIA acquisition of ARM, with both being major silicon players in a small space, would probably invite regulators in the US and EU to pick apart the deal. This could make the acquisition less likely, but it would be a powerhouse move for NVIDIA to acquire ARM were it to happen. ARM is now working with Apple on its own departure from Intel into AMD silicon, so this would bolster that. We'll follow this story as it develops, but the only advancement thus far is that, according to Bloomberg, NVIDIA is aggressively pursuing a deal and attempting to close within a few weeks. If you ever wanted to know in this last story what a baseball stadium would look like filled with characters from The Sims instead of people, Fox Sports can scratch that itch. Sports isn't our usual beat. That might shock some of you, but it's not. And this time it bleeds into the world of technology, specifically because there's some usage of Unreal Engine here to try and televise various sports things. Baseball, I think, is this one. So a couple things we know about this. Unreal Engine and some custom animation work is involved in making characters that actually look a lot worse than you would see in a sim racing game where they're just sort of plastered to the side of the racetrack when you drive by. So that's the quality we're going with for this. But we did feel the need to mention this because as we're currently living under the threat of human malware, sports events with actual people in the stadiums might be a while off yet. And in order to try and keep things going but still normalize the viewing experience so that people can feel just like they would in the real stadium, Fox Sports is adding in the fake F1 2016 era 3D sort of animations in the background. The virtual crowd is what this is being called, and the virtual crowd was designed by Silver Spoon, an animation company Fox Sports chose to work with. According to Engadget, the virtual crowd is the result of augmented reality, camera tracking, and real-time graphics, and it was all done in Unreal Engine. The virtual fans can be built with different colored clothes, they can cheer, and they can even do the wave. Impressive, the extent to which technology has come. Fox Sports debuted this technology, if you call it that, at the Milwaukee Brewers and Chicago Cubs game. And while the virtual crowd may not have seemed out of place if you didn't look too close, it wasn't without some hitches. Some of the fans were obviously sitting and standing on top of their chairs rather than sitting in them or standing in front of them. Some of the virtual fans also seemingly glitched in and out of the crowd. And it seems like, given all this, the virtual crowd, maybe this is what we can do. Okay, Fox Sports, I'm going to give you this one for free. We take the pathfinding of Skyrim and the animations used for the virtual crowd so that you get some of this where they just start walking into things and throw in the old need something, and then you'll have a good viewing experience. Anyway, this is the future apparently. We're looking forward to when they replace the players with virtual players as well and actually just make it a video game. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly or patreon.com/gamersnexus. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.